A city on edge. Cardiff, Wales, February 1988. It was a cold, damp winter evening in the Docklands area of the city. The kind of night where the streets glisten under the orange glow of the streetlights and the wind carries a faint echo of the nearby sea. At around 8 p.m, people were heading home, pubs were closing, and life in the Welsh capital was winding down. But behind one quiet door in a small flat on James Street, something truly horrific had happened, something that would unravel into one of the darkest stories in modern British criminal history. When the police entered that flat, they were met with a sight so brutal that even seasoned detectives had to step outside to compose themselves. Inside was the body of 20-year-old Lynette White. She had been murdered in an act of violence so frenzied and personal that the scene almost looked unreal. What began as a murder investigation soon spiraled into one of the most shocking tales of injustice and corruption the UK has ever seen. Who was Lynette White? Lynette was just 20 years old, a bright and kind young woman from Buketown, the multicultural heart of Cardiff. Known for her striking red hair and warm smile, she was described by friends as someone who lit up every room she entered. But beneath the surface, Lynette's life was complicated. The area she lived in was poor, struggling with unemployment and crime. Lynette had fallen in with the wrong crowd and, like many young people in the area at the time, found herself caught in difficult circumstances. To make ends meet, Lynette was reportedly working as a sex worker. It wasn't something she was proud of, but she was trying to survive, saving money, hoping for a fresh start. Those close to her said she was planning to leave Cardiff to build a better life, but she would never get that chance. The discovery. On the night of the 14th of February 1988, Valentine's Day, Lynette's friends became worried about her when she didn't show up where she said she would be. Around midnight, police were called to her flat on James Street. What they found there would stay with them forever. Lynette had been stabbed over 50 times. The walls were splattered with blood, her body showing clear signs of a violent struggle. The attack had been sustained, deliberate, and deeply personal. Forensics were immediately called in, and investigators said it was one of the most disturbing crime scenes Wales had ever seen. Whoever had killed her had done so in a fit of rage. But in 1988, forensic technology was limited. DNA testing was still in its infancy. All detectives had were blood samples, partial fingerprints, and a community living in fear. A desperate investigation. The Cardiff police were instantly under enormous pressure. The brutal nature of the crime and the fear it caused meant that they needed answers, and fast. The case became a media storm, with headlines describing a Valentine's Day horror. But days turned into weeks, and no suspects were found. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts, and the lack of forensic progress frustrated the team. Eventually, detectives focused on a local group of men, 5 of them, who were known to frequent the area. They became known as the Cardiff Five: Tony Paris, Youssef Abdullahi, Stephen Miller, John Actie, and Ronnie Actie. There was no physical evidence linking them to the crime, But in their desperation to solve the case, police leaned heavily on unreliable witnesses and intense interrogations. The false confessions. Stephen Miller, Lynette's boyfriend, was 26 years old at the time. He had a low IQ and was known to be easily influenced. During questioning, police interviewed him for hours, using intimidation and psychological pressure. Eventually, Miller broke down. He confessed, but his confession was full of contradictions and inaccuracies. Still, the police had what they needed. With Miller's statement in hand, they charged all 5 men with Lynette's murder. The trial, held in 1990, was chaotic. There was no forensic evidence, no DNA, and no reliable eyewitnesses. Yet, after a long and emotional trial, 3 of the men, Miller, Paris, and Abdullahi, were convicted of Lynette's murder and sentenced to life in prison. The other 2, John and Ronnie Actie, were acquitted, but their lives too were ruined by association. For the city of Cardiff, it seemed justice had been served, but this was just an illusion. The truth emerges. Years passed, but doubts about the conviction never went away. Journalists, campaigners, and legal teams began uncovering serious flaws in the investigation. In 1992, after a series of appeals, the convictions of the Cardiff 3 were overturned. The Court of Appeal ruled that the police had used oppressive methods to obtain false confessions. It was one of the most significant legal reversals in British history, and it left one burning question. If these men didn't kill Lynette White, then who did? DNA and a breakthrough. Fast forward to the early 2000s, DNA testing had advanced dramatically. Cold case teams re-examined the evidence from 1988 using modern forensic techniques. Among the preserved samples was a tiny spot of blood found on a skirting board inside Lynette's flat. When tested, the DNA didn't match any of the Cardiff 5. Instead, it matched a man named Jeffrey Gaffour, a 38-year-old security guard who had been living just a few streets away from Lynette at the time of her murder. Gaffour was arrested in 2003. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed. He told detectives he had attacked Lynette in a rage after an argument over money. 15 years after the crime, the true killer was finally caught. The aftermath. The revelations caused outrage. The Cardiff 5 had spent years in prison for a crime that they did not commit. Their lives were destroyed and families were torn apart. The police officers involved in the original case were later charged with perverting the course of justice in what became the UK's largest ever police corruption trial. Although most of the charges were eventually dropped, the scandal left a permanent scar on British law enforcement. For Lynette's family, there was a small measure of closure, but nothing could erase the pain of knowing the wrong men had suffered for so long, while her real killer lived freely for over a decade. The legacy of a crime. The murder of Lynette White remains one of Wales' darkest stories, not just for the brutality of the crime itself, but also for what came after. It exposed how desperation for a conviction can destroy innocent lives. It showed how fragile justice can be, and how truth sometimes takes years to emerge. Today, the case stands as a warning that in the pursuit of justice, shortcuts can lead to tragedy. Lynette White was only 20 years old. Her life was stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. But her name will forever remind the world that justice must always be built on truth.